You ever come home from a long work trip, all excited to hug your kid, only to find a stranger packing up his childhood like it was on clearance? Yeah, that was me. I came home from a 3-day work trip, suitcase still in hand, expecting a hug from my son. Instead, I found a stranger packing up his childhood like it was clutter on display. She didn't look rushed. She looked entitled. Each toy, each book, each crayon drawing went into a box like it violated a fire code. When I asked who she was, she didn't give me a name, she gave me a job title. Community Standards Coordinator, she said, like that gave her keys to people's homes. Then she looked me up and down and said, "Families like yours should really learn how to integrate better." And before I could even respond, she called 911 and told them an aggressive black man was threatening her. That's when I realized racism doesn't always wear a hood. Sometimes it wears khakis, carries a clipboard, and talks in code. What would you have done? Let me know where you're watching from. I'm Miles Bennett, 36, single dad to an 8-year-old named Caleb, trying to raise him with kindness in a neighborhood that talks a lot about values, just not ours. I work freelance in design so I can be around for my kid, which I thought made me lucky. Turns out, in Juniper Hollow, having time to be present just gives people more time to monitor you. Caleb looked at me, confused and scared, like he couldn't decide if he'd done something wrong or if the world had just tilted sideways. I knelt beside him and told him it wasn't his fault, but I could feel the heat in my chest rising. When I stood up, Beverly was already pulling out a clipboard like it was a weapon. "Kids like Caleb don't need so many possessions," she said flatly, as if she'd been asked for an expert opinion, "and families like yours need clearer guidance on how to maintain community harmony." That line hit like a slap wearing a velvet glove. Families like yours. She didn't need to say more. I'd heard that phrase before, in banks, at schools, in HOA meetings where concerned residents suddenly grow an interest in lawn height and trash bins when the family moving in looks a little different. Officer Santiago arrived within minutes. Latino guy in his 40s, cool eyes, quiet voice. Beverly greeted him like she'd been rehearsing. "Thank you for responding so quickly to this safety issue," she chirped, handing him a manila folder thick with printed pages. "I've documented several behavior concerns." I stood there, stunned, as she laid out photographs of Caleb's room, notes about weekend music, and citations for our grass being too long by 2 inches, like we'd committed botanical treason. She even had something labeled aesthetic non-compliance, which apparently meant Caleb's crayon drawings didn't match the neighborhood's visual theme. I asked her, "Did my son draw a gang symbol or a spaceship?" She didn't laugh, just pointed to a printed HOA-looking letter and said she was authorized by internal community policy. That's when Caleb whispered, "She came before, Daddy. When you were gone, she told me she had permission." And just like that, my voice turned to stone. I hit record on my phone. "Officer," I said, "this woman entered my home without consent, harassed my son, and is now presenting self-created documents as justification." Beverly didn't flinch, but her fingers tightened on that clipboard. Officer Santiago raised an eyebrow and asked, "Do you have any legal authority for interior inspections?" Beverly handed over a letter on plain letterhead with no logo, no seal, and a signature that looked suspiciously like her own. "It's pre-approved for compliance reviews," she insisted. Santiago didn't look convinced. I could see him scanning the room, taking in the boxes, the fear in Caleb's face, and the absurdity of the situation. Beverly tried again. "We're dealing with an integration mismatch. These kinds of households often struggle to adapt to established values." And there it was, dressed up in policy talk, but reeking of prejudice. She wasn't here for order, she was here for erasure, and my kid's room was just her fur. That day taught me something I never forgot. Some people don't just fear difference. They try to smother it with rules they make up as they go. It's not always fire and brimstone. Sometimes it's fine print and fake authority. Sometimes it's a woman walking into your house with a clipboard and a smile, acting like your family is the exception to the HOA rule book she wrote in her head. That afternoon, I told Officer Santiago I wanted a formal complaint logged, and I looked Beverly in the eye and said, "You can pack up your lies and get out. This room stays exactly as it is." Caleb hugged me tighter than he ever had, and Beverly, for the first time, had nothing left to say. But I knew it wasn't over, because if she had a folder on us, how many other families had one too? And if this was her version of standards, then it was time someone rewrote the manual. Officer Santiago started flipping through the folder Beverly handed him, and I swear, it looked like she was auditioning for a spin-off of Law & Order Suburbia. She had everything in there, photos of Caleb's room from different angles like it was a crime scene, a spreadsheet of noise complaints tracking the decibel levels of Saturday cartoons, and, I kid you not, a full page dedicated to the height of my grass over the past 3 weeks. "You'll see here," Beverly said, pointing with her well-manicured nail, "this property exhibits ongoing urban aesthetic disruption." Urban aesthetic disruption? What is that? Did my kids' crayon drawings violate zoning laws now? I watched Santiago raise one eyebrow as he scanned the pages, and I could tell even he was trying not to laugh at what she was calling evidence. This was either the most overqualified neighborhood watch operation in history, or the pettiest attempt at social engineering I'd ever seen. Then Caleb tugged my sleeve and said in the quietest voice, "She told me my room makes the neighbors' houses worth less." He wasn't crying. He wasn't angry. He was just confused, like a kid who got told Santa wasn't real and wasn't sure who to believe. My chest tightened, not from rage, but from watching my son try to make sense of being judged by his toy shelf. I looked at Officer Santiago. "You hear that?" I asked. He nodded slowly, but didn't say a word, just kept flipping through Beverly's hand-picked gallery of what she'd labeled long-term cultural misalignment. That's when I knew. This wasn't about noise or lawns, it was about difference. And Beverly Quinn wasn't just enforcing rules. She was writing new ones as she went, and only certain families ever seemed to get the memo. Beverly pointed to a fake-looking document in her packet and said, "I've been operating under the neighborhood's internal compliance charter, Article 4C. She said it like she was quoting scripture. Santiago took the paper, held it up, and squinted like he expected it to be watermarked. It wasn't. No city seal, no legal signature, just her own name printed twice and a whole lot of bold font. "Do you have a record of who authorized this?" he asked. "The community," she replied, vague as a horoscope. That's when I pulled out my phone and hit record. "Officer, I'd like this noted," I said, loud and clear. "This woman entered my home without permission, took unauthorized photos of my minor child's room, and is now presenting self-created paperwork to justify what amounts to harassment." Beverly didn't even flinch. She'd practiced this. She wasn't just nosy, she was organized nosy. Then came the twist, the kind that makes you sit up in your chair. Mrs. Choi from across the street stepped onto our porch, still wearing her gardening gloves, and that nervous look that says, I wasn't going to say anything, but now I can't not. "Excuse me, officer," she said, soft but firm. "I saw her go into the house yesterday. Mr. Bennett's car wasn't in the driveway. She stayed for over an hour, and today I saw her again, with boxes." Beverly tried to wave her off. "This isn't necessary, Mrs. Choi." But it was too late. The air changed. Her carefully built narrative that she was just a good citizen preserving neighborhood charm started to crack. Santiago turned toward her again, this time with a bit more bite. "Ma'am, did you enter the home while no legal guardian was present?" Beverly straightened up like posture could win a case. "The child allowed me in," she said. "He was cooperative." "And just like that," Caleb whispered, "that's not true. She told me not to tell." I stepped forward and looked Santiago in the eye. "He's 8. He doesn't consent to anything. She came in knowing I wasn't home. She manipulated a child and is now calling it cooperation." Santiago gave Beverly a long, slow look. "Do you have any documentation of consent?" She opened her mouth, closed it, then handed over another letter. This one, a sad little printout with a generic template header and the phrase "Compliance Courtesy Access" typed in Times New Roman like she'd copied it off a rental agreement. Santiago barely glanced at it. "This isn't legal documentation, it's a flyer." Beverly exhaled sharply. "You're not understanding the purpose of my work," she said. "These lifestyle choices introduce volatility into what was once a cohesive neighborhood." Volatility for a child's bedroom. That's when I realized this wasn't about order. It was about control, and she didn't see herself as overstepping. She saw herself as defending something sacred, a version of the neighborhood that only existed in her imagination, and it sure didn't include us. Santiago asked if she had any official standing with the city. "No," she admitted, "but I've been maintaining internal documentation for months." She sounded proud of that, like she was keeping neighborhood history alive. "I've got files on half the block." The officer's jaw tightened just slightly. He turned to me. "Mr. Bennett, would you be willing to submit a formal complaint?" I nodded without hesitation. "And I'd like to know who else she's been watching," Beverly scoffed. "I'm doing the work nobody else has the backbone to do." "Backbone? Ma'am, the only thing you've got is a printer and too much time," Santiago said. "I'll be filing an incident report. Please don't leave town until we've spoken again." Beverly turned pale, but her lips stayed tight. She wasn't used to being told no. She was used to being feared, tolerated, and let loose on whoever didn't trim their hedges on schedule. As she backed away, clutching her precious folder like it might save her from consequences, I knelt beside Caleb. "You okay, buddy?" He nodded slowly. "She said we weren't the right kind of family." I looked him in the eyes. She was wrong. And she's not in charge of who belongs here. And deep down I knew, if she had a file on us, she had a file on others, people who hadn't spoken up because they didn't think anyone would believe them. But now we had a record, a witness, a cop who was listening. The first layer of her armor had cracked, and just like that, her clipboard didn't look like authority anymore. It looked like evidence. And I was ready to find every other page she had the nerve to file. So if you think that was the end of Beverly's clipboard crusade, you'd be wrong. That folder of hers? It was just the tip of a much uglier iceberg. And what we uncovered next? It didn't just affect my family, it shook the whole block. If you want to know just how deep this rabbit hole goes and who else she tried to erase, make sure you hit that subscribe button, like this video, and share it with someone who still believes in community standards done right. Because, trust me, in the next part, we find out Beverly wasn't just nosy, she was keeping files. Real ones. And not just on us. The next morning, after Caleb left for school, I sat down with a cup of reheated coffee and started digging. Not into my inbox, not into design drafts, into Beverly Quinn. I figured anyone who carries a clipboard like it's a courtroom summons probably leaves a trail. And sure enough, 3 clicks deep into her digital footprint, the cracks started showing. She had a deactivated LinkedIn page with just enough public information to piece things together. Former HR consultant, 2 years at a real estate firm, and a short-lived gig at a diversity advisory nonprofit that she left under vague circumstances. I called a buddy who works in employment records, and he sent me a note she probably thought had vanished. Departed due to ongoing conflicts with organizational inclusion goals. Translation? Fired for being allergic to progress. But it was her public posts that sealed it. Phrases like preserving community identity and cultural overreach in suburban spaces appeared like she was running for mayor of Mayberry. It wasn't a one-time incident with us. This woman had made it her personal crusade to curate the neighborhood like it was a museum, and we were the wrong kind of exhibit. Still, online rabbit holes can only take you so far. So I walked across the street to talk to Mrs. Choi in person. She welcomed me in like she'd been waiting. After a cup of tea and a few polite deflections, she finally let out a sigh like she'd been holding it for months. "She told me," Mrs. Choi said, her voice tight, "that my garden was aggressively ethnic. Like cilantro was about to jump the fence and spray graffiti on someone's siding. She said the smell of lemongrass didn't match the established sensory profile of the block. That's when I realized Beverly didn't just dislike difference. She wanted to erase it. With her fake title and her real audacity, she was trying to convert culture into code violations. I asked if she'd ever written anything down. Mrs. Choi nodded and pulled out a file. Photos Beverly had taken of her backyard, typed letters slipped into her mailbox with words like unacceptable presentation and non-compliant flora. Apparently, she thought bok choy was a botanical offense. I left that house feeling something twist in my gut. This wasn't about a rogue HOA enthusiast anymore. This was organized weirdness. I decided to knock on a few more doors. That's when I met Aisha and Victor Romero, third house down, corner lot, known for their weekend barbecues and loud, joyful music. They invited me in with a raised eyebrow and a look that said, "So she got to you too, huh?" We compared notes, and I almost dropped mine when they showed me what they had. Copies of anonymous complaints filed with the city, clearly Beverly's writing, describing their son's birthday party as a disruptive cultural demonstration and calling the smell of grilled elote an invasive culinary intrusion. Aisha held up a letter. She told us the aroma of Quiles didn't align with the olfactory tone of Juniper Hollow. Victor laughed, bitter. Apparently, cilantro is now a weapon of mass devaluation. They had cameras installed after Beverly showed up during their 4th of July celebration to measure the decibel level of cousins singing Selena songs. But the worst part wasn't the pettiness. It was the pattern. Victor pulled out a notebook, not a legal one, just a plain spiral, and said, "She's been watching us." Like actually watching. She knows when Aisha gets groceries, when our guests come over. She once sent us a note saying our recycling bin rotation schedule created an unpredictable aesthetic experience. I stared at him. "You think she's keeping files?" "I don't think," he said. "I know. We saw her outside last month with a notebook, jotting down who parked where and when." The air went cold. This wasn't passive-aggressive lawn gossip. This was surveillance, dressed up as stewardship. And she'd been doing it quietly, banking on the idea that nobody would connect the dots. That's when I knew what I had to do. If Beverly wanted to play community queen with her fake titles and flimsy policies, then I'd beat her at her own game, using her own language, her own words, but with the whole neighborhood watching. That night, I sat at the dining table, Caleb asleep upstairs, and started planning what I would call the first ever community standards meeting. I wrote the phrase at the top of the page with a Sharpie, the same one Beverly used to label everyone else's life. But this time, the clipboard wasn't hers, it was ours. If she'd been targeting one family at a time, then the only way to stop her was to make it public, to take all her secret folders, all her passive-aggressive paper trails, and shine a flashlight on them. Because you can't silence people who finally started comparing stories, and judging from what I'd seen in just one afternoon, Beverly had been busy. But now, so was I. And trust me, when a neighbor stops pruning their rose bushes and starts checking the law, you know something's coming. Something louder than a lawnmower and sharper than a clipboard, and I was ready to deliver it. The pavilion at Juniper Hollow Park had seen its fair share of birthday parties and bake sales, but never a community standards reckoning. I stood there holding a folder not unlike the one Beverly carried like a security blanket, except mine wasn't fiction. Mine had receipts, actual printouts of her fake authorization letters, copies of complaint forms with her handwriting all over them, and sworn statements from 3 families. I opened the meeting with her favorite line, "In the interest of preserving community values." That got a few smirks. "Today," I said, "we're discussing one very active resident's attempt to create a neighborhood that only exists in her head." And with that, I called up the first speaker, Mrs. Choi. She stepped forward slowly but spoke with steady conviction. "She told me my garden was inappropriate," Mrs. Choi began, "that my lemongrass and bok choy created confusion." She held up a letter Beverly had slipped into her mailbox, printed in bold, passive-aggressive Times New Roman. "Culturally aggressive vegetation disrupts the neighborhood's traditional appearance," the crowd murmured. "She called my grandson's dragon kite symbolic pollution." gasps now. And then Mrs. Choi looked directly at Beverly, who sat stiff as drywall. "You made me feel like my home was foreign, but I was born in Missouri." And just like that, the spell started to crack. Beverly tried to interject, but I cut her off. "You'll have your turn," I said. "That's what real meetings do. We wait our turn." Next up were the Romeros. Victor came up first, followed by Aisha carrying a folder of her own. "We were told our daughter's quinceañera was a noise violation," Aisha said, her voice shaking. "She took pictures of our backyard, our guests' cars. She said chiles and mariachis weren't in line with community standards." Victor added, "She called our food ethnically pungent." Someone in the back muttered, "Are you serious?" And I could see heads turning. Then Aisha held up a page, a printout from the city's complaint portal. 7 complaints in 2 months, all from the same IP address, Beverly's. "She wanted us quiet, invisible, and grateful," Aisha said. "But we live here, and we're not going anywhere." The applause that followed wasn't loud. It was heavy, like a tide rolling in. Still, Beverly didn't blink. She just gripped her clipboard like it was glued to her hand. And then came the Singhs. Amar and Priya walked up together with their daughter Anika standing between them. Amar spoke first. "Last Diwali we put up string lights, just like we do every year. 2 days later we got a notice taped to our door. Foreign religious displays should be kept indoors to preserve neighborhood neutrality." He looked around. "We thought we were alone, that maybe we were being too sensitive, but now we know this wasn't personal, it was the pattern." Then Priya added, "She told her daughter her sari made her look like a cultural commercial." Anika looked down at her feet. "I didn't want to wear it anymore," she whispered. That was the moment something broke. Something you could feel. You could hear the hurt, the shame, the slow erosion of identity wrapped in polite language. But it wasn't just those targeted who felt it. The entire community was starting to shift in their seats. Right then, just when it seemed Beverly couldn't squirm any deeper into denial, her husband Eddie walked in, unexpected and visibly uncomfortable. A working-class guy in a plumber's shirt and scuffed boots, he stood in the back until I nodded him up. "Mr. Quinn," I said, "you asked to speak." He stepped forward, cleared his throat, and looked straight at his wife. "Patricia's been telling me she's the elected coordinator of community standards," he began, using her real name like it was a confession. "But we've never had an HOA, never had elections. She printed the documents herself. I found the templates on her laptop." A stunned silence fell over the crowd. "I thought she was helping people," he continued, "but she was just making people miserable." "Patricia," Beverly froze, eyes glassy, mouth set. Her authority collapsed like a papier-mâché statue in a hurricane. One good splash of truth and the whole thing dissolved. And just when you thought she might finally own up, Beverly stood and delivered her closing act. "You don't understand," she hissed. "These people are changing the character of our neighborhood. They come in with their smells, their noise, their flags and food and holidays that don't belong here. Property values matter. Standards matter." That's when Mrs. Dunbar, young mom, white, soft-spoken, stood up in the back, holding her toddler on one hip. "You know what matters," she said. "My kid plays with Caleb. She's learning Spanish from the Romeros and learned what Diwali is from Anika. That's not disruption. That's community. And you, Beverly, you're the only one who doesn't belong here." Applause burst like it had been holding its breath. Neighbors started clapping, nodding, even standing. Beverly stood alone, clipboard shaking slightly. Her illusion had broken, and the crowd wasn't buying her version of belonging anymore. And just like that, the woman who tried to control an entire neighborhood with a clipboard got publicly unmasked. By her own husband, no less. But if you think Beverly's story ends here, you haven't seen what happens when fake authority meets real law. In the next part, the city steps in, subpoenas are served, and Beverly learns that community oversight doesn't mean surveillance and discrimination, it means accountability. Hit subscribe, give this video a like, and share it with someone who needs to know that truth doesn't just set you free, it calls a meeting. And trust me, The next one comes with legal consequences. When Councilwoman Liana Moreno stepped into the pavilion, everything changed. Not because she raised her voice. She didn't. It was the clipboard in her hand, the real kind, with the city seal stamped at the top and a staff member shadowing her with a folder of legal documents. You could almost hear Beverly's spine tighten. For the first time, someone had walked in with more authority than her, and unlike Beverly's fake papers, Councilwoman Moreno's clipboard actually meant something. She introduced herself, thanked us for our patience, then got straight to it. I've received multiple credible reports of unauthorized surveillance, racial harassment, and forged municipal documentation conducted by one resident, Mrs. Beverly Quinn. Beverly tried to interject, but Liana held up a hand and said, "Ma'am, you'll have a chance to respond after the allegations are formally listed." That was the moment I realized this wasn't just a neighborhood spat anymore. This was official, and it was about time. As Councilwoman Moreno laid out the violations, unauthorized entry, forged HOA credentials, targeted harassment, privacy violations, the color began to drain from Beverly's face like someone had pulled the plug on her ego. Then Eddie, her husband, stepped forward again, this time holding a plastic storage bin. "I found this in our garage," he said. Folders, notes, photos. She kept track of people's schedules, grocery trips, visitors, even her own family. He held up a file labeled Quinn Household Internal Standards. "She kept a file on me," he added, and folks around him murmured. Beverly looked like she'd been hit with a slow-motion truth bomb. Her obsession with control had gotten so deep she couldn't stop cataloging anyone who didn't fit, including the man who shared her roof. Her clipboard hadn't just backfired, it had boomeranged. And now the whole neighborhood was watching it smack her right in the HOA. Councilwoman Moreno flipped through a few pages from Eddie's bin, nodded grimly, then addressed the crowd. "For those who've been affected, I encourage you to submit formal statements. Harassment like this is not only unethical, it's unlawful." Aisha Romero was the first to step up, then Mrs. Choi, then Amar Singh. Each one held up copies of letters, photographs, screenshots, evidence of a campaign that had started in the shadows and finally come into the light. "She told my daughter her sari was too loud for the neighborhood," Priya said, her voice steady. "She took photos of my mother's herbs," Mrs. Choi added. Councilwoman Moreno nodded and added, "These aren't just community disputes. These are civil rights violations, and under Ordinance March 7th, 15, this level of surveillance and fabricated authority can be prosecuted." Suddenly, Beverly's favorite words, standards, values, property, character, had lost their magic. In the presence of law, they turned back into what they always were, excuses. Still, Beverly tried to regroup. "I was protecting neighborhood character," she insisted. "Preserving property value. If we let every kind of cultural display take over, what happens to the image of Juniper Hollow?" Moreno didn't blink. He pulled out a document, read directly from it. Section 18B of the Fair Housing Act prohibits any conduct intended to exclude, isolate, or intimidate residents on the basis of race, religion, or national origin, including under the guise of aesthetic preference. It was like someone read Beverly her own eulogy in municipal code. "But I wasn't trying to intimidate," Beverly said, grasping at straws. "I was trying to maintain cohesion." Moreno didn't raise her voice. She just lowered her clipboard. "Ma'am, cohesion isn't when everyone looks the same. It's when everyone feels safe." That was the final nail. You could feel the room let out a collective exhale. Like everyone had been holding their breath for months. And then came the sentence that hit harder than any of us expected. Councilwoman Moreno turned back to Beverly and said, "You're now under formal investigation for forgery, unlawful entry, and discriminatory harassment. We'll be monitoring your conduct, not the other way around." Beverly went white, not pale, white. The clipboard that had once made her feel like a sheriff now looked like evidence. Her eyes darted toward Eddie, then back to the crowd, and for the first time I saw something behind all that fake authority. Fear. Not the kind you feel when you're misunderstood. The kind you feel when you finally realize you're not in control anymore. The irony couldn't have been clearer. The woman who tried to surveil us would now be watched by people with actual badges, real legal muscle, and no patience for her clipboard cosplay. Beverly didn't go to jail, not that kind of story. But she didn't walk away untouched either. The city hit her with mandatory community service, a restraining order that kept her from contacting or surveilling anyone she'd previously monitored, and a full bias education program she had to complete before she could even attend another community meeting. She fought it, of course, claimed she was misunderstood, victimized, just enforcing value. But when you build your reputation on forged paperwork and spy tactics, it's hard to play the victim. The clipboard went back in the drawer, and Beverly disappeared from neighborhood life like a bad trend that finally aged out. And just like that, the air got lighter. Kids played louder. Sidewalk chalk came back. It was like someone let summer breathe again. We didn't move out, we stayed, and we rebuilt. 3 months later, the neighborhood voted to create a real, democratically elected homeowners association, and somehow, still not sure how this happened, I became the first president. Mrs. Choi became vice president, and Victor Romero took the secretary role. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The people Beverly tried hardest to silence were now running the show. But this time, the rules weren't hidden in someone's garage. We drafted a diversity charter, built conflict resolution policies that required actual mediation, and made sure any concerns filed included names, dates, and context, not just feelings and finger-pointing. We turned the HOA from a weapon into a welcome mat. Not because we wanted revenge, but because we wanted to make sure no one else ever used paperwork to erase a neighbor again. Caleb started therapy a few weeks after the confrontation. At first, he didn't say much, just colored pictures and avoided anything that looked like a clipboard. But slowly, week by week, he opened up, drew happier things, talked more. One day, he came home and said, "Dad, Ms. Linda says feelings don't have to match furniture." I don't know what that meant exactly, but it sounded like progress. He started smiling again, bringing home classmate drawings, even organizing a comic book club with Anika Singh and Maria Romero. Watching him regain his joy felt like the real verdict. Beverly could be fined, retrained, and supervised, but Caleb healing? That was the only outcome that actually mattered. Because it meant we hadn't just stopped her, we'd started something new. And that newness? Man, it bloomed. We held the first Juniper Unity potluck in the same park pavilion where Beverly had once been queen of complaints. Mrs. Choi brought dumplings, the Romeros made tamales, the Singhs brought sweet rice and lentils. I grilled burgers and played old Motown, and nobody measured the decibels. Kids ran around swapping languages and snacks, and at one point I heard Priya's daughter teaching Caleb how to say, "Happy birthday," in Hindi. "Dad," he whispered, "can we do this every year?" And just like that, a new tradition began. We'd turned what was once a battleground into a backyard. We didn't erase our differences, we celebrated them with music, food, and shared mosquito bites. It was loud, colorful, and beautifully inconvenient for anyone clinging to the past. Even Eddie changed. He divorced Beverly 6 months later, quietly, respectfully, moved to an apartment across town, but he started showing up at our meetings, never said much, just sat in the back, listened. One day, he offered to help fix the Romero's fence after a storm. Another day, he donated supplies to the Singh kids' art class. He became a quiet ally, the kind who doesn't need applause, just purpose. I'll admit, I was skeptical at first. But sometimes the hardest truth to face is the one you shared a kitchen with. And Eddie was learning, slowly, what Beverly never had, that community isn't something you curate, it's something you contribute to. His change didn't erase what had happened, but it reminded us that growth is still possible, even when the roots were in bad soil. Looking back, I realize we didn't just win. We evolved. We created something stronger than the bigotry that tried to divide us. We built a neighborhood where difference isn't a disruption, it's the design. and no one's clipboard gets to decide whose holiday lights are too bright or whose barbecue smells too spicy. Beverly tried to gentrify culture with a binder, but you can't gentrify a soul. You can only suffocate it, unless the neighbors fight back. And we did. We fought not with fists or fences, but with voices, votes, and truth. And what grew out of that wasn't just unity, it was legacy. Caleb's birthday came around again not long after the dust settled. He didn't want a theme this year, he wanted everyone. So we invited the block, every single family, every kid, every set of grandparents. There were cupcakes, tamales, curry puffs, and a bounce house donated by the Dunbars. And when it came time to blow out the candles, Caleb didn't wish for toys or trips. He looked at the crowd, all laughing and eating and spilling punch on the grass, and said, "I wish every kid had a birthday like this." Justice didn't knock. It kicked the door down and brought cake. And the best part? We all stayed for a second slice. And you know what? As I watched Caleb laugh with his friends, some wearing saris, others munching on empanadas, all of them shouting over each other like only kids can, I realized this wasn't just a story about a bad neighbor. It was a story about what happens when good people stop staying silent, when we stop letting community standards be weaponized as code for make it all the same. Beverly thought she could control a neighborhood with fear and fake rules. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't know, is that real community can't be micromanaged. It grows wild in all directions with messy joy and unexpected friendships. She wanted order. What we needed was connection. And in the end, the very people she tried to erase became the ones who built something better. This story mattered because it reminds us, you don't always have to fight back with power. You just have to show up with truth. And when truth is shared, neighbor to neighbor, it spreads. And when it spreads, it heals. And when it heals, it builds. So if this story made you feel something, whether it was anger, pride, or just a deep breath of relief, do something with that feeling. Share it with someone who needs a little hope. Leave a comment below. Tell me what kind of community you want to live in. Hit that like button so this story reaches more people who need it. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next episode, because there are more stories out there where justice gets clever, kindness gets loud, and the underdog finally gets heard. Thanks for sticking with me. I'm Miles Bennett, and this was The Day We Turned a Clipboard into a Community.